format. So I think it'd be better if we can keep it conversational. I will talk about, I think one of the things that needs to be underscored to begin with is that the main impetus for Nepal Picture Library when we started was the conversation in the last 15 years we've been having about inclusion, diversity, multiculturalism, and what the responsibility of disciplines like history is towards the new politics of inclusion and representation. So I think we were, thinking about these issues a lot, and so NPL in some ways comes out of that, because I think even in the early sort of collections that NPL had brought together, the real kind of possibility that the collections had was that it could really show, reflect Nepali history from bottom up, and especially from the studio collections, you could see that even the images of ordinary people that we as Nepali citizens had been quite deprived of, they were turning up in some amounts, Chaudharis, all kind of people going to photo studios, taking photographs. And I think that was sort of in the back of our head, like how do we create an image of Nepal in the image of its people? I think that was the sort of like the framework through which we came to our the two researches we did on Dalits and the Feminist Memory Project, which I'll talk about a little bit. I'll begin by saying that I think the main kind of conversation we have at NPL for the last 3-4 years, and this is the continuing conversation we've been having, is how can we think of archives differently in some ways? And the need to think of archives differently is because of these facts that our histories are actually not told well, and there is this immense need to actually tell these histories. And there is this loss of materials, and we have to somehow work with the lack of information and lack of archives, and yet be able to say something about our histories and different experiences people have had in this country. What that meant for us was that we have to begin thinking of archives in creative and different alternative ways, so that alternative histories about this country could be facilitated in some ways. And I think that also meant for us that the methodologies of doing history also we had to start thinking about how we are talking about history. So I think like for the last 3-4 years we've been having this conversation a lot, about how an archive could look different and how a historical research can look different. So I think what I basically want to share is that from our experience of archive building in the last 3-4 years, what kind of insights we have to offer in terms of generating alternative histories for this country. I think the term representation is something that I would ask everyone to keep in the back of our head, because that's also something we are constantly thinking of, partly because of the sort of like the visual register and visual undercurrent of the term itself, even when we speak of political representation. And I think the slippages of the visual and the aesthetic and the political is something that is very important for us as we design our researches and work and archival drives at NPL. And so I think the main issue for us, and that's what we want to share with you, and hopefully that's what we hope to learn from you also, and this is the main challenge for NPL currently, is how to make NPL, an archive like NPL, an actually useful and usable archive. And I think we're somehow, and the hope really is that we can actually get researchers to come to our archive, use the material and generate historical work from the archive, which we haven't been quite successful at. And I think the exciting thing for us today also was that maybe we can actually convince researchers to come in and use the material. And I think there are a lot of challenges to that, and I'm guessing this audience would know, partly because archives are, as sort of like places where histories are stored. The main function of archives is to, in a way, authorize or create legitimate or authoritative claims about past. That's what the function of the archive is. And so, for an archive like NPL, Timothy, we are working primarily with visual documents. What would it mean to lay that kind of claim, that you can use these kind of material to generate authoritative and legitimate claims about history. And so, oral history naipani, if you look at the oral history's place in history writing, that itself how is not so guaranteed, all that. So visual research we're not actually quite doubtful that historians will come to visual research in mass as much as we would hope. But that's what we, in a way, we hope to convince, that that there are a lot of possibilities in visual research, and that we would like to share some of the anecdotes of the work that we have ourselves done. So I think the claims we are making is that the need for visual research, one, I think this is the sort of I guess our beliefs in some ways at NPL, is that in a country like Nepal, where literacies, the cultures of reading and writing cannot be guaranteed or cannot be taken for granted, that the place of the visual has to be sort of taken seriously in some ways, or what the visual medium can do. And I think talking to photographers, people who work with photography a lot, I think this is a kind of the thing that we encounter a lot, we experience a lot about the possibilities of the visual medium. The second is that I think we all, the radical loss of histories, the non-existence of archives, and what do we do with our situation of having to work in this complete lack in some ways, that we don't actually have materials on which we can base our researches. For me, as I was trying to say earlier, is that it's always, for us, it has meant that we have to start being innovative about how we do research and how we also identify materials for that research. And I think an archive like NPL really allows something like that. And I think the last claim, I think I would say, would relate to the kind of poverty of institutions of history writing in Nepal. And I think, again, making a sort of making that lack and poverty a sort of a generated space for us, that we don't have programs. There's even the ones there are, I guess, understandably, there's a lot of credential building, gatekeeping around practices of history. And we are hoping to, in some ways, break that a little bit. So what counts as archival material for NPL? I want to make a brief comment about that as well. I think because we see ourselves as an alternative archive and not the kind of public research archives that historians might be used to, I think the principle of selection for us tend to be slightly different. I think we tend to value, for us, the primary acquisitions at NPL are, ephemeras, photographs, memos, notes, scrapbooks, things like that, like little notes that people keep in their homes, which may not end up in archives. But the reason why some of these documents and materials are preserved are because of the kind of emotional or affective connection that people have with these documents. And so the material, the value of the archive actually comes from the value that the donors have, the emotional kind of value that people place in these materials. And so that's the bulk of the material that we have, this kind of very affectively charged, like even when we sit, it's very sort of that kind of very emotional connection that people have with these materials. So a couple of, I think, memory, maybe Auntie, you want to talk a little bit about that as well, because that's been a concept that we've been playing with a little bit.
Sure. So, I mean, something just to point out over here on the right hand side, history begins at home. We started a bit of a campaign. It started with our immediate circle, networks, friends, family. But then we really tried to push. So we tried to go to towns where we had some connections, but not necessarily large networks. So we went to Birgans. Birgans became a big, actually, spot We went to the east, Dharan side, we went to Palpa, we went to a few of these towns outside of Kathmandu as well, and began a sort of a campaign to get people excited with this idea that इतिहास घरबाट सुरु हुन्छ र तपाईको परिवारको इतिहासले चाहिँ हैन तपाईँ यो नेबरहुडको इतिहास बनाउँछ र यो नेबरहुडको इतिहास विभिन्न नेबरहुडको इतिहास जोड्दै जोड्दै यो एउटा सर्टन समाजको इतिहास बन्छ देशको इतिहास so on and so forth. So that kind of a nara actually was quite something that people responded to quite well, and people would really say yes, oh हाम्रो परिवारको इतिहास पनि हुनु पर्यो नि त देशको इतिहासमा, so really coming from that kind of a as Diwas was saying earlier, I think this these sort of ambitions for inclusion, and these wishes for inclusion within a wider social and political spectrum. So the kind of memory work then that we began to do was working through oral history quite a bit. So a lot of interviews with families, sitting down over cups of teas, over meals that families would offer us, and entering very personal and private spaces that these photographs lived in, and then constantly connecting them to other material, as Diwas was saying, to the surroundings that these photographs lived in as well. And so these family photo albums really became valuable for us, and we continue to work sourcing from personal history collections very closely. We've also been in an effort to try to create interest in a wider community. We've also been working with young writers, so running writing workshops as opposed to sort of going at it from the visual or the history angle, and getting young writers to actually be encouraging them to look at photographs and read photographs and sort of research photographs for their own writing. And then we've also been, like I said briefly earlier, working with teachers and educators to see how can you take say a personal history timeline. So one exercise, to give you a quick example, is हामीले एउटा टाइमलाइन बनाएको थियौँ जसरी हामीलाई नर्मली हिस्ट्री बुक्सहरूमा इतिहास पढाइन्छ 1952मा यो भयो, 1956मा यो भयो, एक्सेट्रा एक्सेट्रा, भेरी लिनियर, भेरी हुनै पर्ने, सो अन एन्ड सो फोर्थ. सो त्यस्तै टाइमलाइन एउटा हामीले विद्यार्थीहरूलाई दिएर अनि त्यसपछि चाहिँ हामीले यो क्लास 7 र 8 को सोसल स्टडिज टिचर्सहरूसँग काम गरेर एउटा प्रोजेक्ट चाहिँ के गरेको थियौँ भने ल अब यो फर्मल अफिसियल हिस्ट्री टाइमलाइन लिएर घर जानु अनि घरमा चाहिँ गएर आफ्नो बुवाआमा, हजुरबुवा, हजुरआमा, अरू नातेदारहरूसँग पनि कन्डक्ट इन्टरभ्युज and then situate your family history alongside this formal national history. And so 1952 मा हामी कहाँ थियौँ त, हाम्रो परिवार कहाँ थियो, तपाईहरुको बिहा कुन वर्ष भयो, त्यो तपाईहरुको बिहा भएको सालमा नेपालमा पोलिटिकली के भइरा रहेछ त, हजुरआमा हजुरबुवा कुन सालमा गाउँबाट तल सर्नु भयो, so on and so forth. So एउटा parallel personal history timeline create गरेर चाहिँ कसरी this idea of history सँग चाहिँ at a young age how can we begin to connect history, memory, the visual, the oral history interview format. So त्यो किसिमले पनि हामीले ट्राई गरिरहेका छौँ. Challenge के छ भने, I mean these have all been great fun projects to work on, तर they've all been very ad hoc. So यही कुरालाई चाहिँ हामीले कसरी अलिकति mainstream educationमा चाहिँ कसरी यो कामले अलिकति प्रभाव पार्न सक्ला त भनेर हामीले अब सानोठिनी CBC देखि लिएर टिच फर नेपाल भन्ने एउटा संस्थासँग र एजुकेसनमा काम गर्नुहुने दुई चारजना अरू साथीहरूसँग पनि हामीले चाहिँ अहिले अब कुराकानी गर्दै आइरहेको छौँ. तर यसलाई यो एड हक एउटा आर्ट प्रोजेक्ट अथवा एउटा रिसर्च प्रोजेक्टबाट अलिकति मेन स्ट्रिम इम्प्याक्ट पार्न सकिने किसिमको काम चाहिँ हामीले कसरी गर्न सक्छौँ होला भनेर हामीले पनि अहिले पनि वी आर ट्राइङ एन्ड दिज आर च्यालेन्जेस द्याट वी have still not figured out. So.
I think from what NT also just said, I think it should be clear that when we speak of history at Nepal Picture Library and the researches we design, we actually really are talking about public history. And I think that needs to be underscored a little bit because I think for us the main issue is apart from the kind of academic kind of pursuits of history that happen, it's also a claim that ordinary people are making use of, engage with history and intercept in history making and meanings of history in all kinds of ways, including methodologies of history. And I think that's where we want to sort of situate ourselves, that understanding what is happening in the day-to-day life of history in Nepal, including memorialization, monument building, all kind of ways in which history, even when we don't have means through which we can study history, the kind of life it has in the public space, that's something that really excites us a lot, and that's a sort of like the space on which we work. So the two major work we've done in the last 3 years since 2016. One we titled it Dalita Quest for Dignity, and यसको एउटा किताब पनि हामी निकालेको छौँ, which is over there. I think यहाँको लाइब्रेरीमा पनि छ होला copy. You can look at that. And last year we did a project called the Feminist Memory Project, where we started to assemble narratives that women were actually chronicling of women's history in very informal ways in some ways. And so we've been sort of like trying to see what kind of narratives we can build of women and their experience of modern Nepal. So I'll base the rest of the conversation here on those two researches. And both those researches were in some ways, when we were sort of thinking about it, it's not really about, there's this sort of like a pocket of people who are ghettoized or minoritized or marginalized, and they have their own like little spaces here and there. That let's look at that. But it was really for us a way of sort of examining the perspectives, situating in those kind of spaces, and witnessing history at large, and what kind of patterns we can understand about history, Nepali history at large, from those kind of positions. So that's been a sort of like a modus operandi for us. And both of those projects for us was also in a way about publicness, what it meant on one for Dalits and one for women, to claim publicness in this country, and what the history of that has been. So I'll give some examples. This one, यो चाहिँ हामीले 1981 मा, I guess this audience would know about this कर्जाई आन्दोलन भन्ने दाङको हामीले यो चाहिँ सुनेको थियो. We had done this, I had done this oral history of Bhumigat women long time ago, and then I had encountered stories about Sarah Schneiderman had studied Piskarko त्यो जुन छ नि किसान थामीहरूको आन्दोलन. So similar to that, I think Dang had this women-led movement 1979 ma. So we were very interested in this, partly because we were sitting there thinking about how can we actually make the feminist project also inclusive, intersectional, and partly like doing Madhyasko history was becoming so difficult for us. So we really wanted to make sure that जसरी भए नि गर्नुपर्छ भने. So this was sort of in our head, and we really यो चाहिँ हामीले रिसर्चै पठाएर कलेक्ट गरेको. And the interesting thing here for me is all of these photographs were actually not in one place. They were all with individual women after Gharma. So we sent a researcher to sort of actually collect those individual photographs and put it together. And I think it's really useful to see what an archive like NPL can, through such kind of collection and collation, make possible. One, the kind of, like when you view these photographs together, the kind of histories that begin to unfold in some ways, especially cultural histories, including to the Gahana, Ruko, the kind of the studio setup. And all of these photographs we are assuming were taken for Nagarikta ko लागि. So it opens up all kind of histories. Yo चाहिँ कर्जाई भन्ने ठाउँ घोरैबाट बाहिर छ. So we've been thinking about that a lot, how to sort of use photographs like this, collations like this to open up certain kind of histories. But the more interesting thing for us was that this was a bit of history that hasn't been claimed, so to speak, by any larger narratives. I think apart from UML's tried to claim this a little bit as part of their history, but even there it has not a very stable kind of place. And it became a really useful exercise for us to see what happens when we actually not take given narratives to tell history, but look at bits of history that have been forgotten altogether and retrieve it from the dustbin, so to speak, of history. And the kind of new kind of claims that can be made from that. So some of it, I think we've been talking about forms of political communities we can speak of around Karjahi, for example. When we were working on this, as well as the other sort of archival photo retrieval we do, the go-to methodology for us has been, as NT was saying, oral histories, which is basically sitting with people, talking to them for long hours and recording it, listening to what they're saying. But I think more specifically than oral history, I would say it's something like photo elicitation, where what we do is we get the people to talk about photographs and see what kind of memories get triggered by the photographs. And then that's what we record in some ways. And then we have seen that the way how people speak about their own photographs and the kind of values and meanings that people assign to those photographs reveal quite a lot about not just specific anecdotes of history, but also larger sort of interpretive structures of history, as well as attitudes towards history, more importantly for us. How sort of people are relating to this thing called history. This word called aitihasik gets thrown around a lot when we sit with people and talk to them. And I think it becomes also an exercise of how people are relating to this term aitihasik, which becomes a really interesting exercise for us. So, for example, time combo, maybe I'll just skip these. So, I guess I had 3 examples, but maybe I'll just speak of one. You're saying your Dotiko collection, Gomati Shestrako collection, and we had asked her, what is happening in this photograph, for example, and the way she would narrate, what's happening. Just from this photograph, we were getting to hear about the entire, in a way, the history of infrastructure and road building, for example, in Far West. That even her, just the experience, the experience of coming from Doti to Nepal, as this was, she was setting out to come to Kathmandu, sorry, not Nepal, from Doti. But to tell that story required of her that she go through this history of the history of infrastructure, the history of sort of, actually also environmental history of rivers and forests, and what traveling was like, going to India, coming across to Janakpur, all of that, So it was very interesting to see how we actually could use photos like this to do a history of infrastructure, for example. This one, Lakshmi Karki, we had asked her, in the photograph we see her wearing a garland, for example, and we'd ask, why are you wearing a garland? And that opened up a whole story about the Panchayat Viruddhako Andolan from in the 80s, and the kind of stories and the entire sort of structure of radical the protest culture at the time. This one is also quite interesting for us because when you speak to Charimaya Tamang, because of the work she does now, she, the way she would speak about her own experience in another circumstance we would probably hear of. But when we asked her about the photograph, the kind of focuses she had, so she told us a story about how she had to go to the Indian embassy here repeatedly so that she could get her kurtas back Bombay, because she was rescued from the brothels in 1995, and so all her stuff was still left in Bombay. So her story was about what she did to retrieve her stuff. And so that opened up actually a different kind of history for us about sort of this, the pride she had in the kind of, that could be sort of reflected in the stuffs that she had bought or amassed in India. That's my stuff. I bought that from my earning. So I want those stuff back, the gahanas and the kurtas and the kind of fondness she had for the clothes that she had bought while she was in Bombay. So that opens up a very different kind of narrative for us than the ones that we would hear of, even from her, in other kind of contexts. So I think one other thing I would like to point out is we've also been working on journals like this. So we've noticed that there's a lot of, I think working on the FMP and Dalit, we've seen Dalit history, we've seen that there's a lot of investedness on both projects we did. Investedness in the idea, as I was saying, of the Aitihasik, and the sort of like the attitudes people have towards the idea of the Aitihasik. Especially in the FMP, we saw that when they were sort of in the villages, we retrieved these journals where they were sort of diligently and painstakingly sort of cataloging and chronicling important moments in women's history. From Yogmaya, then this happened. So that kind of exercise of chronicle building, journal keeping, and then they would copy it and circulate it as a way of, and that's what they would spread. And so we've retrieved a lot of these, in a way, attempts at this, let's say, casual history writing, and these kind of, that's been very interesting for us to see. I'm going to rush through this a little bit. You're saying, we got this from Padam Sundas ji, and I think Dalit Kosai we saw less of that. I think in women's history, we saw a lot of those sort of moments where women were writing down, keeping journals, actual sort of like very strong awareness and orientation towards history. That and the feeling that when they were organizing or going underground, that they were doing something historical. That kind of sense was very strong. We didn't see that as much in the Dalit case. But even in the Dalit case, we did retrieve scrapbooks, this kind of, keeping of journals, preserving of press clippings, and sort of, they take on their own sort of meanings for the people who preserve these histories in these forms, in scrapbook forms. And I guess the claim that I would make is that the scrapbooks like this and the photographs we work with have a lot of meaning, and the production and circulation of these things are very important, especially when historical knowledge about women's history and Dalits are very scant. That these things fill in some of the role of that. And I think this is also an example of what I would say, the auto-archivation, or this memorialization of one's history, or one's sort of involvement in history that we kept seeing in the projects that we've been doing. And these are the kind of documents that we see through which people maintain a kind of attachment to the past, and the kind of fantasies of the past that people have. And identities that are built from those kind of fantasies about the past. So we've sort of, apart from photographs, we've also increasingly been preserving these documents as well. And so I think for us, broadly, when we work in these projects, we see how people are sort of trying to build history from absence in some ways, and then I think these kind of documents are key, ephemeras like this. The other thing I would we noticed was that apart from the collection, the kind of and scraps that we have seen, we've also seen various efforts of archival practice at home itself. For example, these two examples I will show. Women who had been collecting within their homes. So this one is a collection we found in Punya Prabha Dungana's home, where she had been trying to sort of create an archive of all the women who had been involved in the women's class organization of the Panchayat Sarkar. And so she had basically diligently sort of kept photographs and journals, not journals, but basically profiles of every single woman who had been part of the women's class organization. And we found this incredible archive in our house where all of their photos turned up. This one is from Parijat's collection, and this one is quite incredible as well because it's so ambitious and thorough. And the archive that she was creating was of all the Nepali women who had ever written and published. And so she was trying to create an archive of everyone who had ever published. And so we retrieved this collection as well, and I think a lot of it has been lost, but we managed to get quite a bit.
This is not the full collection.
This is not the full collection, but this is, I think, most of what we have. I couldn't find, so we didn't find materials like that. There were only one or two archives that people had in their homes that we managed to find. So what that meant for us was we had to rely on photographs and materials from outside, which complicated the kind of the story, because the project was really about what we can tell about the texture of Dalit identity in some ways. But when you're using materials from the outside, that became a little difficult for us. So it became a slightly different exercise. So I think, this one, a lot of our material for the Dalit book came from the Peace Corps collection, and I think, and the comments that the book has generated has also been about that. Photographs created by outsiders looking in, and the problems of that. And I think we've been trying to sort of, when we made the book also, we were very careful, attentive to these issues of representation. And I would urge you to look at the book if you have successfully done it. But despite that, I think that there's a reliance on photographs like this. But we did find materials like this, and I think, for example, this one, I wish someone would do a research on this, because your Mithai Devi Vishwakarmako collection by Nikaleko, some photographs, and I find this quite interesting because again, what it tells us about the techniques of self-representation of Nepali Dalits, and these pictures are from early, let's say, 50s, early 60s, and I find it really interesting that, and just studio photographs, but in a lot of these studio photographs, we see them posing with, magazines, newspapers, reading, and then we've seen, Ambedkar image mapani, there's like a pen and the book, that kind of thing. So that iconography we kept seeing, briefcases, portfolios, and I feel like that opens up an interesting kind of point of inquiry for us about what it meant in that period for Nepali Dalits in terms of claiming space in public life, or being public in some ways. And so things like that we've sort of highlighted through our research. This one also is, I think people will be familiar with this one, your 2007 ko Uma Devi Badile gareko protest ko Badi ko protest bhako थियो नि त्यो बेलाको photo हो. And I think we know, I think this is the first photographs that was circulating, and for us also we've used this photograph to make claims about the kind of assertions that it began to make in the last 15 years, let's say. But after this, I think your feminist project, I think we actually went to Bardia, and then we retrieved her personal album. And that was another really interesting exercise because, the kind of interest she had in photographs and in being photographed was like super interesting. That, she was very deliberate in how she was being photographed. She had stories behind every photograph, that, where she took it, how she took it. And that kind of deliberate engagement with photography, again allowed us to think about what it meant for Dalits, what the story of self-representation could be for Dalits. And I think this is something that we need to work on. That deliberate use of photography and tools and techniques of representation by Dalits themselves. This one was a famous case from 2016. And then for the exhibition and the book, we've used these images, mainly to contrast with the kind of images that were circulating of this guy who was killed for eloping with his Brahmin girlfriend in 2016. And so the image that was circulating was of him being hanged. And it was basically of his death and his body and his corpse that was circulating on Facebook. But after that, from Jagaran Media Center, we had retrieved these photographs from his phone itself. Like, these are the selfies that he took. And I think, and then we see, and I think this sort of like, to notice what Dalits were doing in some ways, with the knowledge about the particularities of vision in Nepal, and the kind of decisions that Dalits could or could not make about their own visibility. Those kind of questions opened up for us through images like this. So I think that's what I have for Dalits right now. I think I'll end there. And if there are questions.